Oh, hi, Governor. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I'll just get right to it if I can. My first question is: are you part of that lawsuit that's challenging the South Carolina Republican decision to cancel 2020's primary?
I'm not.
Um, the GOP statement says that the reason why they canceled that is that, quote, there's no other legitimate candidate for president besides Mr. Trump. Your reaction to that?
Uh, that's not what people tell me on the ground in South Carolina. Um, that's not what people tell me in Iowa or New Hampshire. What people tell me is that there ought to be a contest of ideas within the Republican Party as to what it means to be a Republican. That some people very strongly agree with the president, but some people don't as well. And that's what elections and debates are all about.
Can you talk about if aha moment is the right word? What was the aha moment that made you toss your hat into the ring for president?
I watched the first two Democratic debates, and there was simply a debate of more versus more with no consideration whatsoever for how do we pay for all of these things. And on the Republican side, concurrently, there's no debate as well. Uh, the president has said it's not a problem. We don't need to worry about it, but I believe we do. And I think that many of the people in the low country of South Carolina, south of the Savannah River or north of the Savannah River, believe the same, that you can't go on spending forever at a family level, at a business level, or even at a government level without there being consequences. And I think that we're at an amazing tipping point that has profound ramifications in terms of somebody's ability to achieve the American dream, or frankly, in our ability to perpetuate the American civilization.
The South Carolina GOP says that your presidential bid is an attempt on your part to revive a dead political career. Your response to that?
If I wanted to revive a political career, the last thing in the world I would do would be to take a long shot run for the presidency against Donald Trump. I mean, all the people that have run against Donald Trump have ended up with diminished political stature. I mean, think about Little Marco or Lion Ted, or, I mean, he gives everybody a nickname and it seems to stick. This would not be the way to revive a political career. This is instead about a conviction that has been long held that indeed we can't go on spending beyond our means without there being consequences. And why don't we have a national debate? We have a chance once every 4 years to have a debate on where we go as a country, on what it means to be a Democrat, on what it means to be a Republican. And I think the Republican Party has lost its way on debt and deficit and spending, and we need to have a conversation about it. That's what this race is about. And I think it's telling that Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when asked, what's the biggest threat to American security? The answer is not the Taliban, not the Chinese, not the Russians, but his answer was the American debt. And that's telling when it comes from a military man. And so that's what this campaign is about, and he can, rain on it, and the executive committee can circle the wagons around the president, and they can pretend that we're a cult of personality, which has never been what the Republican Party has been about to me. But that's what too many people are doing. They're simply saying, no, we picked our horse, let's circle the wagons, let's not have any debate. But if you stop and think about it, there are football teams in Chatham County that are getting ready for the big game Friday night, and they practice and they scrimmage, and they're better off for it. Competition's the American way. And yet what the Republican Party, the executive committee of the Republican Party, not rank and file members, but the executive committee has said in this instance is, no, we're not going to scrimmage. We're not going to practice. We'll just wait for the big game come next November. I think it is not only a mistake in terms of its ramifications in our lives, given how important I think this debate is, but it's frankly a mistake at the party level as well.
If the South Carolina GOP does not reconsider based on the legal challenges, do you stay in this race?
Yeah. It means I don't spend time at home. I'm a two-term governor. I had 12 years in the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress, gotten to know a lot of folks across the state in that process. So I think it's certainly a setback. But it means you go spend time in other states. It means you spend time where I just spent time in New Hampshire and in Iowa, and 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 you keep moving forward because I'm going to look for any way possible to elevate what I think is indeed a systemic threat to our way of life and to the American civilization, given the pileup of debt and deficit and spending under this president's watch. And what I think is interesting is when President Trump ran for office, he said, if you elect me, I will eliminate the debt over the 8 years that I might be in office. That's what he said. That's what he promised. Instead, his own budgets, not Democratic budgets, but his own budgets, proposed to increase the national debt by $9 trillion over his time in office. It's also telling to me that, this last debt deal that he just struck, after saying he'd never signed another debt deal like it, it adds $1/3 trillion in new spending over the next 2 years, and it adds $2 trillion of spending over the next 10 years. We're again playing with real fire, and though he calls himself the king of debt, he's been in an enviable position at certain junctures in his life. His dad was able to bail him out. We will not be so lucky as American taxpayers because the Chinese and a variety of other civilizations around planet Earth will not come to our aid. We are on our own on this one.
Your thoughts, speaking of that, your thoughts on this impeachment inquiry?
I think they're very serious charges, and I'm not going to prejudge the process. I'm not on the committees of jurisdiction, but they're very serious charges. If one is suggesting that the President of the United States can go and turn and basically ask his Attorney General, who is on the American taxpayer dime, to aid a foreign government in investigating a domestic political foe, it would seem to me that we're crossing a red line, but ultimately that's what this inquiry is all about, and we'll see what they find in it.
Your thoughts on the president's tweets regarding impeachment, about this being a coup, his talk of a civil war if he's impeached, and his demand to know the whistleblower's identity. What do you think when you're reading these things?
I agree with Senator Grassley. Senator Grassley from the Midwest came out strongly. He's a Republican on behalf of the whistleblower, saying, wait a minute, that's not the way the system was set up. The idea of a whistleblower is that they have some degree of immunity, of protection, so that they will actually speak up when they see something that's wrong. That's the very design of the whistleblower. And as to the other, too much of what the president says is about ego, and it's about himself. And at the end of the day, the problems that confront us, whether we live in Savannah, Georgia, or Beaufort, South Carolina, or over in Augusta, are not about what's going on in Washington. They're about what's going on in our daily lives. And are we having debate and discussion on those issues rather than the latest, tempest from the president via Twitter?
How are you going to be better for the people? Because you've been in politics a very long time. They play hardball. They're certainly going to bring up Brazil in the affair. How are you prepared to handle that?
Just to tell the truth, which I've done. I said, look, I failed. I let myself down. I let a lot of people down. I'm well aware of it. But there's a measure of humility and empathy toward others when you have failed, and particularly when you've publicly failed. And there's a degree of learning in the way that you approach others. And so all I'd say is, unlike the president who said there's nothing in the world that he is sorry for, I am quite sorry for that event and how I handled it. And what's most telling of all is the people who knew me best along the coast of South Carolina, where I grew up, those folks said, in the wake of all that, we don't approve of how you handle that chapter of life, but we know you and we trust you. We'll give you a second chance, and in fact, we'll send you to the United States Congress to represent us in Washington, D.C. That's a very humbling journey to go on, and I think that the president could use a little bit more humility in the way that he approaches problems and others.
And finally, what do you want South Carolina voters, especially those here in the Low Country, to know about the state executive committee's decision to cancel this primary?
I'd ask them to make their voices heard. This thing's wrong. It's wrong at many different levels. It's wrong at at a democracy level, because our founding fathers and a whole lot of folks who died in the aftermath of the start of this country have prized this precious notion of a vote and each of us being able to express ourselves via the ballot. And the idea of the Republican Party being the party of disenfranchisement, of taking people's voice away, is something that does not make sense. That's why the Post and Courier editorialized forcefully, saying they believed that this was wrong. And, the different red herrings that the executive committee came, well, it's about saving money. No, it's not about saving money. The Post and Courier editorialized it would not cost 1 penny more to run that Republican primary concurrent with the Democratic primary. It wouldn't cost a penny more. That they're coming up with excuses simply to circle the wagon around the president and protect him. But really it's a sign of weakness, because we all ought to be able to stand out on the public square and say, this is what I believe and this is why I believe it. And that comparing and contrasting of ideas is indeed the American way. That competition of ideas and ideals is the American way. And so it's wrong in that it takes that away from us. It's also wrong in that South Carolina has enjoyed disproportionate voice, really, in the presidential process due to its primary as first in the South. And now you're going to take that voice away from 5 million folks who would have, candidates coming through. I mean, I'm going to go spend time in New Hampshire and Iowa. I won't spend time in South Carolina, just because if you can't have an election here, there's no reason to spend time here. It's the reason that so many Democratic candidates are crisscrossing the state right now. That concurrent debate ought to be taking place on the Republican side. So I would just ask that people make their voice heard. This isn't right at several different levels, but most of all for the fact that it takes away voice of South Carolinians. So I ask that South Carolina Republicans make their voice heard on how they'd like to have a contest. I'd also say this. It's a sign of weakness. In other words, if they allege that they have 80 or 90% levels of support. Well, if you have 80 to 90% level of support and you have a chance to take a win, you do it all day long, particularly if you're first in the South and you have an amplified effect on primaries down the line. The fact that they're not doing that says somebody's looking at numbers that say that the president's support may be a mile wide, but perhaps an inch deep.
Wow. I want to circle back to the thing that you mentioned about the spending and the debt, because traditionally over my own lifetime, I've always associated political rhetoric that when they talk about spending and building up the deficit, that was something that was what the Democrats did. The Republicans always ran on a lean, mean fiscal machine, and it was the Democrats that run up the debt. What's it like to be a Republican and to watch this happen from the sideline?
It's sorely disappointing. It makes you wonder, well, the old saying is if you don't stand for something, you don't stand for anything. And the Republican Party, even if they didn't act on it at times, at least they talked about it. They said, this is important to us. It was a key tenet in the Republican platform. And to throw that aside is dangerous. I mean, because whether you're a Republican or whether you're a Democrat, you have a brand loyalty that says, why, I believe in that party because of these different ideals. You begin to lose some of those ideals, you lose followers. I mean, I think it hurts the party in the long run, but more importantly, it hurts us, me and you, because never before in peacetime have we had this level of debt. Never before in peacetime have we been running these kinds of deficits, which goes to the heart of why Admiral Mike Mullen would say that this is a national security issue. In just 3 years, we will spend more on more on interest costs than we do on defense. So if you're a Republican and let's say you care passionately about national defense, you ought to care about the debt issue. If you're, let's say, a progressive Democrat, you care passionately about the lives of young people, we will spend more on interest than we do on all programs on behalf of children at the federal level in just 1 year. The fastest category of cost growth in the federal government is interest. I mean, we are setting ourselves up for such a fall based on a variety of different things that are coming into play, and we're not even talking about it.
What's your plan to fix that if you're successful and the American people get behind you and say, okay, Governor Sanford, fix it?
I'd say first, you got to recognize you have a problem to fix a problem. I would say that most people don't perceive it as a problem because nobody's talking about it. And I guess, well, if nobody at the presidential debate level on Democrat or Republican side is talking about it, I guess it's not a problem. But that's not true. The numbers tell a very different story. We are setting ourselves up for the greatest financial fall in the history of our nation, outside of perhaps the Great Depression. And so what I do is first I would talk about it, and that means you got to have buy-in. You got to have not just a tweet at some strange hour of the night, but you have to have hundreds upon hundreds of town hall meetings across this country saying, here are the numbers, let's sit down together as Americans and let's figure this out. And what's historically happened is that Americans have had an amazing ability to come together if they perceive something as a real threat. I mean, they call them the greatest generation. It's amazing what they did on what was obviously a real threat, but everybody saw it as a threat during that generation. This is that kind of time. And so what I do secondly is I was the author of a thing called the Penny Plan when I was in Congress, and it said, let's all get in the boat together. Not urban versus rural, not South Carolina versus Georgia, not Republican versus Democrat, but if we all got in the boat together and we all shared whatever level of sacrifice might be entailed together, would you make a sacrifice? And most folks I talk to say, the folks if I'm a grandparent, the folks I love most on earth are my grandkids. I would make a sacrifice. And what the bill that I authored is called the Penny Plan, is if you cut just 1 penny out of every dollar of federal benefit for everybody, not just some people, but everybody, then within 5 years you could be back to a balanced budget. And that's where I would start.
Wow, thank you so much for your time. Anything else that you want to add that I didn't ask you about or you didn't talk about already, but you want to share with voters, not just in South Carolina, on both sides of the state line here in the Low Country and Coastal Empire?
No, I think we've covered most of it for now.
You did.
Thank you. How about that?
You did. You're welcome.